I have spoken enough for 100 lifetimes. The echoes of my voice have filled halls, crossed courtyards, lingered in libraries, and settled upon the ears of eager disciples like dew upon morning petals. For years, I adorned my thoughts with language, sculpted silence into verses, carved feeling into rhythm and rhyme. I believed that to speak was to illuminate, that to teach was to reach into the soul of another and place there a spark of divinity. I stood before kings and beggars alike, and I offered my words as bridges between the temporal and the eternal. And yet, with every word I uttered, something within me began to grow strangely restless, a discomfort quiet as a splinter lodged deep beneath the skin. It was as if the very sound of my own voice began to obscure the truth it longed to reveal. I remember the weight of that realization. It did not come in thunder or revelation. It arrived slowly, like mist creeping into a valley at dawn. It was a feeling at first, a weariness that words no longer satisfied. They no longer reached deep enough. I would speak of longing, and yet the ache inside me remained unmoved. I would speak of union, and yet feel estranged from the very essence I praised. I saw my listeners nod, their eyes bright, their hands raised in praise, yet I could sense how often they clung to my phrases instead of what the phrases pointed toward. They memorized my poems and debated my metaphors, building temples around symbols while forgetting the silence that birthed them. Slowly, I began to understand. Every word I spoke was like a finger pointing to the moon, and yet all anyone ever did was stare at the finger. One afternoon, unable to carry the weight of my own speech, I wandered to the outskirts of Konya with no destination in mind. The streets thinned, the city's hum faded, and I came upon a quiet orchard where the air was thick with the scent of figs and the murmur of bees. There, beneath the long and drooping arms of a cypress, I sat down, my robes heavy with dust and sweat. My lips, usually eager to form another verse, remained still. I did not try to meditate, nor did I seek divine insight. I simply sat. Around me, the world breathed in slow rhythms. The leaves above whispered in a dialect no man had ever written. A distant brook giggled softly to itself, the wind carried stories no human tongue could translate. And there, in that sacred stillness, I felt something settle inside me like a bird returning to its nest. What unfolded within me was not a thought but an unveiling. A soft loosening of knots I hadn't even known were binding me. I realized that my words, however sincere, however infused with love and longing, had always fallen short of the truth. Not because they were untrue, no, many of them have been born of deep encounter, but because the truth is not something that can be possessed or conveyed through sound. The divine does not reside in syllables. The beloved is not chained by grammar or form. I saw how language, for all its beauty, was a veil, delicate, shimmering, but a veil nonetheless. Even the holiest scriptures, the most exquisite poetry, are but approximations. They are shadows of a light too radiant to be captured. In that moment, a strange joy welled up inside me, the joy of surrender, the relief of no longer needing to explain. I looked up at the sky, pale and vast, and for once, I did not try to name it. I watched a sparrow dart from one branch to another, and I did not wonder what message it carried. I simply let it be. And in that act of letting be, I felt myself drawn into the heart of a presence so vast, so gentle, and so complete, I could not speak. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had finally come upon something that no saying could contain. Silence, I understood then, was not emptiness. It was fullness. It was not absence. It was the very presence of the divine, vast, endless, and unutterably tender. I remained beneath that cypress for hours, unmoving, barely breathing, not praying in words but being in prayer. I was no longer the speaker, no longer the poet, not even the teacher. I was simply a vessel, emptied of noise, filled with silence. And in that silence, I heard the voice of God, not in thunder, not in language, but in the stillness between moments. In the hush before the breeze, in the pause between heartbeats, in the silence that exists just after the last note of a flute song, that is where the divine dwells. When I finally rose to my feet, I did not feel the need to compose a verse about what had occurred. I did not rush to my students to tell them what I had discovered. For the first time in my life, I knew that the truest wisdom is not taught, it is tasted. And it is tasted in silence. So when I say that silence is the language of God, I do not mean it metaphorically. I mean that silence is how God speaks, in the spaces between our thoughts, in the quiet chambers of the heart, in the deep stillness where the soul remembers what it truly is. All else, even the most beautiful poem I have ever written, is but a poor translation. And yet, I continue to write, not because I believe my words are sufficient, but because I hope they might lead another to the silence that waits behind them. In the early years of my life, I was crowned with the jewels of learning. My mind was sharp, my memory vast, and my hunger for knowledge insatiable. From Balkh to Baghdad, from Damascus to Konya, I studied under scholars, debated with philosophers, and preached to multitudes who revered my command of theology and jurisprudence. The Quran was etched into the architecture of my thought, the sayings of the Prophet formed the rhythm of my speech. I could recite the hadiths and interpret their layers, and I could chart the path of the soul through the stations of spiritual refinement using the precise language of doctrine. My students wrote down my lectures with trembling hands. Dignitaries bowed in respect. To many, I was a master, a sage, a scholar of unmatched clarity. But within me, a silence had started to pulse beneath all the sound, a soft, insistent beat of longing that could not be answered by knowledge alone. I began to feel as though I were navigating a vast palace made entirely of mirrors. I could see endless reflections of truth, but never truth itself. The more I spoke of God, the more distant he seemed. The more I explained love, the less I felt it burn in my chest. I became haunted by the subtle awareness that language, however beautiful, had its limits. No matter how carefully I formed my sentences, there was always something they left out, something that could not be caught by the net of words. And though I was admired for my eloquence, I was beginning to suffocate inside its cage. Then, like lightning striking a dry field, Shams al-Din of Tabriz entered my life. He did not come with books or credentials. He came with a silence so radiant, it broke the sound in me. The first time we met, it was as if the world stood still. He looked into me, not at me, but into me, and in that gaze, I felt the whole edifice of my identity begin to tremble. He asked questions that ignored the scaffolding of my scholarly pride. He asked not what I knew, but what I had felt, what I had risked, what I had surrendered. And when I answered with learned phrases, he listened with an unblinking stillness that made my replies feel like smoke. I sensed that nothing I could say would impress him, and strangely, that was a relief. I had spent years being revered. Now, at last, I could be real. Shams did not believe in learning for its own sake. He believed in burning away illusions, burning away ego, burning away all that obstructed direct union with the beloved. Knowledge that does not open the heart is a cage, he told me once. Even a golden cage is still a prison. I did not answer. I couldn't. His words fell like rain on dry earth. And though I did not yet understand him fully, I recognized that he spoke not from intellect but from experience. His knowledge was not recited, it radiated. He carried a light within him that I had only glimpsed in rare flashes, moments of grace that had quickly vanished like dew in sunlight. We began to spend our days together, talking, yes, but often simply sitting in silence. Long hours would pass with no words exchanged, and yet I would leave those moments feeling as if volumes had been spoken. I began to notice the world more deeply, the space between a bird's wing beats, the pause before a leaf detaches from its branch, the stillness in the heart of the wind. It was as if Shams had turned my senses inward, toward the wellspring of the soul. He was not interested in doctrine. He wanted to know if I had ever listened, truly listened, to the silence within myself. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence. The silence that vibrates with the fullness of being. One night, we walked the streets of Konya beneath a sky heavy with stars. The world was sleeping. A single candle flickered in the window of a tea house. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and then went quiet. We said nothing as we walked. The silence between us was not empty. It was alive, sacred, as if the divine were walking with us, not in the sky, not in heaven, but right there between our steps. When we reached the courtyard of my home, I turned to him and asked, "Shams, how do you live with so much silence?" He looked at me and said, "How do you live with so much noise?" His answer struck me with the force of truth. I realized then how much of my life had been spent talking, to students, to colleagues, to myself. Even in solitude, my mind was filled with words. Commentaries, quotes, arguments, poems. The constant churning of interpretation. But interpretation is not the same as experience. And what Shams was offering me was experience. A direct encounter with the sacred that needed no translation. Over time, I began to change in ways I could not explain. I lost interest in lecturing. I began to miss my own silences. I would walk to the Mevlana tomb after dark and sit alone with the stars, not praying in the usual way, not reciting, but simply being. Being with the sky. Being with the breath. Being with that vast silence that Shams had shown me. I began to understand that God was not in the noise, not in the polished phrases or the polished self, but in the raw, silent places of the soul. In the ache that has no name. In the stillness that has no teaching. Some found my transformation alarming. Others called me bewitched. But I knew, deep in the marrow of my being, that I had not been bewitched, I had been awakened. Shams had torn the veil of language and revealed to me the luminous silence beneath. He had taught me not to speak of God, but to listen for God. And what I heard was not thunder, not voice, not command. What I heard was the deep, wordless presence of love itself. So now, when people praise my poems, I smile with humility. They are only shadows, I want to tell them. Echoes. Every word I've ever written is just a trail of footprints leading to the great silence. It is there, in that silence, that the beloved waits, not with answers, but with being. Not with doctrine, but with presence. And when I say, silence is the language of God, I do not speak poetically. I speak from a well so deep, it has no bottom. I speak from the silence that Shams gave me. I speak from the silence that is God. That night, the world seemed draped in velvet, the kind of darkness that comforts rather than conceals. The moon above was a perfect silence, hanging like a thought unspoken, and the stars were not distant, they felt close, like whispers stitched into the fabric of night. Shams and I walked as if drawn by an invisible thread, our robes brushing gently against the dusted stone path, our footsteps soft as if not to disturb the stillness that had settled over the sleeping city. The scent of jasmine lingered in the breeze. We said nothing. There was no need. With Shams, silence was not a pause between speech, it was the whole conversation. We turned into a quieter alley, one I had passed 1,000 times before but never truly seen. It curved like the spine of a question and opened into a small square where a solitary olive tree stood, bent with age, its shadow stretching across the ground like a monk in prayer. On one side of the square stood a modest tavern. Its windows spilled light onto the street, golden and flickering, and inside, voices rose and fell like waves breaking on the shore. A reed flute wept a lonely tune, and beneath it, the drum throbbed with a heartbeat all its own. There was laughter, sharp and slurred, and clapping hands attempting to match the rhythm. The smell of wine and sweat and roasted lamb drifted through the cracks in the door. It was a house of joy, or at least a house pretending to be. I lingered. The music tugged at some part of me that was older than doctrine. The rhythm pulsed through my chest like a memory I couldn't place, and I thought of the way we sometimes danced in the Sema, arms extended, turning until the self vanished into the whirl. There was a kinship between the tavern's music and the rhythm of divine longing I so often spoke of. For a brief moment, I considered stepping inside, not to drink, not to join the revelry, but to feel more closely what throbbed behind the laughter. Was it joy? Was it pain wearing a mask? I turned to Shams, half expecting to see the same curiosity reflected in his eyes. But he did not stop. He didn't even glance at the tavern. He walked on as if nothing were there. That contrast between us struck me, still susceptible to the seduction of sound, him, rooted in something deeper. I caught up with him and said, "Do you not hear the joy inside? There is life there, laughter, music. Can you not seal it in your blood?" He stopped then and turned to face me. The moonlight caught the sharp line of his cheek, the quiet fire in his eyes. He looked not at the tavern, but at me. "Yes," he said. "I hear it. But it is not what you think. The joy that shouts is often trying to drown something else. Look again, Rumi. That laughter, is it not a little too loud? That music, is it not frantic, as if it's afraid of stopping? The loudest rooms are often the ones most desperate to forget their emptiness." His words struck something hollow in me. He was not condemning them. Shams was never one to judge another's path, but he was inviting me to see beyond surface. "Listen," he said, closing his eyes. "Not to the sound. Listen to the silence beneath the sound. The pause between the flute notes. The breath between the claps. The hush before the singer exhales. That space, that stillness, that's where the real joy lives. That's where God hides." I stood beside him in silence. I tried to listen not to the music, but through it. At first, all I heard was noise, layered and chaotic. But slowly, as I softened my ears, I began to notice the spaces, tiny gaps, moments where the sound fell away, where time seemed to hesitate. It was in those pauses that something stirred, something the music itself was trying to point toward but could never fully express. A kind of sorrow laced with beauty, a longing too vast for words. In that moment, I realized the music wasn't trying to entertain, it was trying to speak, and the silence between its notes was its truest voice. Shams opened his eyes and continued walking. I followed, and we didn't speak for a long while. The moon had shifted slightly, and the shadows now leaned in the other direction. As we walked, I felt something inside me had tilted as well. A quiet rearranging. I had spent years filling the silence with wisdom, with verses, with answers. But Shams was teaching me to let silence fill me instead. Not as absence, not as lack, but as presence. As truth. The tavern behind us faded into the distance, but its music still played in my memory, now altered. I no longer heard only the sound, I heard what the sound concealed. And I knew then that silence is not merely what is left when noise ends. Silence is the womb of meaning. It is the breath of God inhaled but not yet spoken. We paused again near a fountain where water trickled down a wall of stone smoothed by centuries. The sound was soft, constant, delicate. Shams knelt by it and dipped his fingers into the stream. "Even the water," he said, "even it sings in silence. You think you hear the water, but what you're really hearing is the space it moves through. The silence gives it shape. Without it, there is no music. Without it, even the loudest sound is meaningless." His eyes met mine again, and I felt like a student before a master, not in knowledge, but in presence. There are teachings too vast for language, and that night, Shams delivered one without ever raising his voice. He showed me how I had been living in the surface of sound, and how God, in his infinite subtlety, was waiting beneath it all, in the gaps we ignore. That lesson was not one I could write into a book or lecture about in the mosque. It was a truth meant to be lived, not explained. It was the kind of knowing that grows only in the quiet soil of the soul, watered by presence and tended with stillness. That night, the city seemed to exhale as we walked home. Lamps flickered low, and the air was cool against our cheeks. I felt no urge to speak. I didn't want to break the silence that had wrapped itself around us like a shawl. Something sacred had passed between us, and I sensed it would continue unfolding long after we returned to our rooms. Long after the night gave way to dawn. Long after shams would eventually vanish, as all things in form must. Even now, when I hear the laughter of crowds or the clatter of flutes, I listen for the silence beneath. And when I write my verses, I try not to capture the truth, but to carve around it, so that the silence may shine through. For it was in that silence, between the music of the tavern and the murmur of water on stone, that I first truly heard the voice of the beloved. And once you have heard that voice, you can never again mistake noise for truth. Shams once told me, there is a door in your heart that only silence can unlock. At the time, I nodded, as if I understood. But I did not. I thought I did. I had read the mystics, recited the verses, walked through the corridors of theology until their patterns etched themselves in my bones. I had taught about divine love, about the unveiling of truth, about the way the heart opens in the presence of the beloved. But those teachings were like maps. Beautiful, yes, but a map is not the terrain. It was not until I sat with the silence, not merely endured it, but welcomed it, that I realized how little I had seen of the true path. That morning after my wordless awakening, I could feel everything within me rearranging, like a house that had long stood in disarray quietly setting itself in order. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Even the urge to share what I had experienced with shams or my students had melted away like ice touched by morning light. Language felt clumsy, too heavy for what had stirred in me. And so I moved through the hours like a man who had returned from a far-off country, changed, but unable to speak of the land he had seen. The world went on. My students gathered beneath the trees near the madrasa, expecting their daily lesson. I came to them. I smiled. But I said nothing. At first, they waited, assuming I was gathering my thoughts. Then, puzzled, they shifted uncomfortably on the carpets. Some looked at one another, unsure if they were part of a test. One of them, the boldest, finally asked, "Master, will you not speak today?" I looked at him with a tenderness that surprised even me. I could have spoken. I could have taught them something from the Quran, or a hadith, or a line of Adder's poetry. But instead, I whispered, "Let's listen instead." There was confusion. A few bowed their heads respectfully, though I could see the hesitation in their eyes. Others seemed relieved, as if released from a burden. And so we sat together in silence under the shade of the fig trees, as the sun slid slowly westward and the breeze stirred the leaves above. At first, I felt their discomfort. The way they shifted, cleared their throats, glanced at the gate. They were used to lessons that gave shape to thought, to discourse that built steps they could climb. But slowly, the stillness began to settle in. The longer we sat, the more the silence opened its wings. A bird alighted on the wall nearby. A dog barked in the distance. The world breathed around us, and we began to hear it. I watched as one by one their faces changed. Their expressions softened. Some closed their eyes. One of them began to cry, quietly, without drama. There was no pain in it, just release. It was as though something old and heavy had been gently lifted from him. I said nothing. I did nothing. And yet, in that nothingness, the sacred did everything. After a long while, when the sun had fallen just low enough to stretch our shadows far behind us, I finally spoke. Just a few words. God was here the whole time. That was all. I saw it land in them, not like a concept to be debated, but like a seed quietly finding its place in fertile earth. That was the lesson. Not a lecture, not a poem, but a shared silence that revealed more than any scripture could. Later that day, as I walked back toward my home, I thought of how much I had once feared silence. How I had used words as armor, not only against others' doubts, but against my own. I used to think that silence was the absence of wisdom, the void left when nothing else could be said. Now I knew that silence was not absence. It was presence in its most distilled and concentrated form. I had spent years polishing my language like a jewel, believing that the right phrase could unlock the divine. But what finally unlocked it was not articulation. It was surrender. Shams had always known this. I remembered the first time I saw him sit in complete silence for hours, unmoving, his eyes half closed, not meditating in the way the Sufis practiced formally, but simply being. At the time, I had thought it strange. I had even felt a touch of impatience. Why waste hours in stillness when the world was starving for truth? Now I understood. In that silence, he had been feasting while I starved on eloquence. He had been sitting at the banquet of the soul while I chased crumbs with ink and parchment. That night, I returned to my chamber and sat once more in the dark, not seeking, not analyzing, just present. The wind came in through the lattice, brushing past the candle without disturbing its flame. I sat cross-legged on the rug and listened, not for God, but to God. The difference was everything. There was no booming voice, no cascade of mystical images. Only the soft hum of being. The breath moving in and out. The heartbeat in my chest. The awareness of presence so thick it felt like light pressing against my skin. And then something beautiful happened. A thought rose in me, not a crafted thought, but one that emerged like a lily from still water. The soul is not separate from God, it is the echo of his silence. I didn't write it down. I didn't speak it aloud. I simply let it rest in me, as one lets light fall through the branches of a tree. I knew then that silence was not a condition to be entered into. It was our natural state. It was the world that had grown loud, not God. And the moment we stop shouting, inwardly or outwardly, we can hear what has been speaking all along. This was not the silence of absence or detachment. It was not void. It was intimacy without boundaries. The silence of one who leans so close you no longer need to speak. The silence of a love so profound that it doesn't require sound to affirm itself. And once you know that silence, once you have tasted it, every word becomes secondary. Beautiful, yes. Useful, sometimes. But always less than what it points toward. So I began to shift, not by abandoning speech, but by treating it differently. I no longer spoke to impress. I no longer wrote to capture truth. I wrote to invite silence. I spoke to guide others to that same presence I had found, not by telling them what to believe, but by helping them hear what had always been with them, beneath the noise of the world, beneath the clamor of the self. The divine, whispering without sound. And now, when people ask me what is the greatest verse I've ever written, I smile gently. Not out of pride, but because I know the truth. The greatest verse I have ever composed was never written. It was never spoken. It lived in the breathless moment between two heartbeats, in the hush that comes just before dawn, in the deep and abiding silence that is the true language of God. All else is translation, some beautiful, some broken, but only silence holds the whole. There came a profound turning point in my journey, one that reshaped not only my understanding of the divine but the very way I moved through the world. It was a slow awakening, born of countless moments when I found myself surrounded by noise of the marketplace, the endless discourse of scholars, the chanting of prayers, the flowing verses of poets, and yet, beneath it all, a persistent void whispered to me. It was a silence, not empty or cold, but alive and breathing, waiting patiently beneath the clamor of words and thought. This silence was the true language of God, and I was only just beginning to comprehend its depth. In the days that followed my long afternoon by the river, I sought to immerse myself more fully in that silence. It was not an absence to be feared, but a presence to be embraced. I noticed that whenever my mind grew restless, racing to formulate thoughts or to respond, the silence would retreat, as if shy or fragile. But when I surrendered, when I stopped trying to fill every moment with sound or reason, the silence blossomed, vast, welcoming, and infinitely rich. It was as if the soul, when uncluttered by noise, could finally breathe in the sacred breath of the beloved. This practice of surrender did not come easily. My heart, trained through years of study and teaching, was still eager to explain, to reason, to guide. The scholar in me resisted the notion that silence could hold more truth than a well-crafted sermon. But each time I yielded, I found myself drawn closer to an ineffable presence, one that could neither be captured in words nor dispelled by doubt. It was a living mystery, both intimate and infinite, delicate yet unshakable. I began to see how much of human suffering arises from our inability to embrace silence. We fear the void because it reveals what we most often hide from ourselves: the fragility, the loneliness, the yearning that words cannot soothe. We clutch at language as a lifeline, weaving stories to protect the self from the terrifying expanse of the unspoken. But in doing so, we build walls that separate us from the very source of our being. Silence, then, becomes not only the language of God but the gateway to the soul's deepest healing. In quiet moments throughout the day, I would remind myself to return to this silence. Walking through the bazaars, I learned to listen not just to the merchants' cries but to the spaces between, to the pauses pregnant with unspoken truths. In the mosque, amidst the chorus of prayers, I sought the stillness at the core, where words fall away and only presence remains. Even in the company of friends and disciples, I found value in shared silences, those pauses that deepen connection beyond speech. One evening, after a day filled with teaching and discussion, I sat alone beneath the vast expanse of sky. The stars were scattered like diamonds on black velvet, each one a silent testament to the mystery that enfolds us. I felt the silence of the night seep into my bones, a cold balm to the restless mind. And in that silence, a question arose within me, not in words, but as a subtle stirring: how can the divine be fully known if we only ever approach through words? The answer was not immediate, nor was it wrapped in certainty. But slowly, it became clear that the divine does not dwell in language, nor is confined by human understanding. God is the silence from which all sound emerges, the stillness in which all motion finds rest. To seek God solely through words is to chase shadows on the wall, beautiful but insubstantial. True knowing arises when we step beyond the realm of speech and enter the sacred quiet where the soul and the divine commune without intermediaries. Since that night, I have carried this truth close to my heart. It humbles me to recognize that no matter how many verses I compose or sermons I deliver, they are but imperfect translations of a reality too vast for language. My poetry, my teachings, my words, they are invitations, not destinations. They point toward the silence, beckon seekers to pause their questions and listen deeply, to find the stillness that holds all things. In the years that have followed, this understanding has transformed my approach to life and love. I no longer fear moments of quietude, I embrace them as sacred. When sorrow or joy rises within me, I meet it first with silence, allowing it to speak without interruption or judgment. I have come to see that silence is not passive but vibrant, an active, living presence that shapes the contours of my soul. This journey has not been solitary. Shams walked with me, not always speaking, but holding space for the silence to unfold. He taught me that wisdom is not in accumulation but in surrender, and that silence is the language in which the beloved whispers secrets to those who will listen. Though he is no longer here in form, his presence lingers in every quiet moment I cherish. Now, when I write not to confine truth but to open doors. I craft verses to point toward the sacred silence beyond the page, hoping that the spaces between words will sing as loudly as the words themselves. For in those spaces lives the essence of all that is divine. In those pauses, the soul finds its true voice. And so, I invite all who seek to join me, not in endless talk or learned debate, but in the deep, wordless listening where God's language is spoken without utterance. For silence is not the absence of communication, it is the purest form of communion. It is the breath, the pulse, the very heartbeat of the universe. And when we learn to hear it, we step into a conversation that transcends time, beyond all words, and into the eternal embrace of the beloved. The evening air was cool and still, wrapped in the gentle embrace of twilight as the sun's last light faded behind the distant hills. I sat beneath the ancient fig tree in the courtyard of the madrasa, its broad leaves whispering softly in the faint breeze, like a quiet hymn composed by the earth itself. Around me, the city of Konya settled into its nightly rhythm, the muted footsteps of those returning home, the occasional murmur of prayer calls drifting across the sky, the rustle of leaves stirred by the breath of the wind. In that moment, I was alone, yet not lonely. There was a presence, a sacred presence, that filled the space between heartbeats, a presence that spoke not in words but in the profound eloquence of silence. For many years, I had devoted myself to the art of speech, the weaving of poetry, the crafting of sermons that sought to articulate the mysteries of divine love and union. Language was my instrument, my refuge, my gift. I believed that through words, the soul could be guided closer to God, that the complexities of the unseen could be rendered visible through metaphor and verse. Yet, even as my voice rose in song and prayer, there lingered a yearning, a quiet ache for something beyond what could be spoken or sung. The verses I composed, the discourses I delivered, though inspired, often felt like fragile vessels trying to hold an ocean of truth too vast to contain. That night, beneath the spreading branches of the fig, I closed my eyes and let the silence wash over me like a cool stream. At first, my mind rebelled, racing to fill the emptiness with thoughts, memories of past conversations, the worries that always accompany a man's heart, the endless stream of questions that had long kept me tethered to the world of words. But gradually, as I yielded to the stillness, the torrent subsided. The noise gave way to a deeper sound, a vibration felt not in the ears but in the very core of my being. It was the language of the divine, not uttered, not inscribed, but known directly by the soul. In that sacred quiet, I experienced a communion unlike any I had known. There was no need for speech, no call for explanation. The heart spoke to heart without utterance, the soul recognized its source in the silence between breaths. It was as if the divine, in infinite mercy and grace, had gently removed the veil of words and allowed me to glimpse the ineffable reality beyond them. This was not an absence but a presence, a fullness that embraced all contradictions, all mysteries, all paradoxes. I thought then of Shams, whose presence had transformed my understanding of love and faith. He had often said, "Words are but shadows on the wall, silence is the flame." I had dismissed this as paradox, a riddle to be solved through argument or poetry. But now I saw the truth in his teaching. Words are necessary, yes, they shape our thoughts and guide our steps, but they are not the source. The source is the silence from which all words arise and into which they ultimately dissolve. To cling too tightly to language is to miss the living heart that beats beneath it. This realization humbled me deeply. I remembered the countless debates I had engaged in, the fervent sermons I had delivered, the eloquent verses I had composed, all worthy, perhaps, but still incomplete. How often had I witnessed misunderstanding, conflict, division, all born from the limitations of speech and the distortions of translation. The truth, I understood, was not in the words themselves, but in the space they inhabit, the silence that lends them meaning in life. From that night onward, I sought to live with greater awareness of this sacred silence. In the bustling streets of Konya, amid the calls of merchants and the clatter of carts, I practiced listening, not merely with my ears but with my heart, to the spaces between sounds, to the pauses pregnant with unspoken truth. In moments of solitude, I embraced the stillness as a gateway to the divine presence, allowing it to cleanse and renew my spirit. When I spoke or wrote, I strove to honor the silence by leaving room for it to breathe, knowing that the deepest wisdom often dwells not in the spoken word but in the silent spaces that surround it. I also came to understand that silence is not a passive absence but a dynamic, living presence. It holds the power to reveal what words conceal, the depths of our longing, the fractures of our soul, the profound unity that underlies all existence. In silence, the soul is stripped bare of pretense and distraction. It meets itself and the beloved in raw, unmediated truth. This meeting transcends intellect and emotion, beyond thought and language, to a place where only being remains. Sometimes, when I shared this insight with my disciples, they struggled to grasp it. Their minds sought definitions, their hearts desired certainties. I realized that silence cannot be taught like a doctrine, it must be experienced. So often, I invited them to sit together in quiet, to set aside their questions and simply be present. In those shared silences, barriers fell away, and a subtle transformation took place, a softening of the self, a deepening of the spirit, an opening to the sacred mystery that cannot be named. This path is not without its challenges. The human heart is restless, craving reassurance through words and stories. Fear often arises in the face of silence, for it confronts us with our own vulnerability and the unknown. Yet, it is precisely in this courage to face the silent depths that healing and awakening occur. Silence teaches us patience, surrender, and trust. It is the teacher that asks nothing and gives everything. In my own life, embracing silence has been a journey of continual unfolding. Each moment of quiet reveals new layers of understanding and love, drawing me closer to the beloved's presence. The silence is not separate from the world. It is woven through every breath, every gesture, every heartbeat. It is the unseen thread that connects all things, the sacred ground upon which all creation stands. As I write these words, I am ever mindful of their limits. They are but fragile attempts to point toward a reality that transcends language. I hope that in reading them, you might feel the silence that lies beneath, the quiet voice that calls beyond the clamor. For silence is the language of God, pure, unbounded, eternal. And all else is but a translation, beautiful and imperfect, striving to touch what can only be known in stillness. So I continue to walk this path, listening for the silent song, living in the sacred space between words, and inviting all who seek to join me in the profound embrace of the divine's true language, the silence that speaks without sound, the silence that is love itself. The more I immersed myself in the profound nature of silence, the clearer it became that silence is not simply a quiet void waiting to be filled, but rather an active, living presence that breathes beneath all things, connects all beings, and holds the very pulse of creation. Early in my life, I believed that the divine must reveal itself through grand declarations, passionate speeches, and brilliant poems, expressions so vivid and loud that no one could miss their truth. I thought that the path to God was paved with words, that through language alone one could grasp the sacred mysteries. But time, experience, and the gentle guidance of my beloved Shams taught me otherwise. It was not in the noise or the clamor, but in the stillness that God's true language is spoken, and it is a language without words. I remember one particular afternoon that remains etched in the depths of my heart, a day when this truth unfolded before me like a blooming rose, revealing layer after layer of beauty and meaning. I had wandered far from the bustling streets of Konya, seeking refuge among the rolling hills and quiet groves that cradled our city. Sitting on a sun-warmed stone, I closed my eyes and tuned myself not to the familiar sounds of the world, but to the silence beneath them. Around me, the wind softened its voice, the birds stilled their songs, even the insects ceased their buzzing. It was as if all creation had hushed itself, holding a sacred breath. In that moment, the usual swirl of thoughts and worries that occupied my mind, concerns about my teachings, the judgments of others, the weight of the world, fell away effortlessly. What remained was a vast openness, an endless expanse within my soul, a presence so pure and profound that it defied all description. It was not a vision, nor a feeling, nor a concept, but the very essence of existence itself, shining forth in its naked simplicity. I felt as though I had been swimming in the turbulent sea of words and ideas all my life, and suddenly, I was lifted onto the serene shore of silence, where nothing was missing and nothing needed to be said. This silence was not dead or empty, it was alive and vibrant. It breathed with me, resonated with the heartbeat of the earth, and sang the eternal song of the cosmos. It spoke in a tongue that required no translation, no grammar, no syllables, because it was understood directly by the soul. In that sacred silence, I came face to face with the divine, not as a distant deity to be feared or worshipped, but as an intimate presence, a love that enfolds and transforms all. This was the language of God, the original and eternal language beyond all human speech. When I opened my eyes, the world looked the same, yet everything had changed. The hills, the trees, the sky, They shimmered with a new light, as if the veil that had hidden their divine nature had been lifted. Every leaf became a testament to mystery, every breeze a whispered prayer. The universe revealed itself as a living poem composed in silence, each moment a stanza in the endless song of creation. I realized then why the great mystics and poets before me, from Rabelais to Ibn Arabi, had all struggled to capture this experience in words. It is a language that transcends words, a sacred silence that only the heart can hear. Upon returning to Konya, I attempted to share this revelation with my disciples and friends. But I soon discovered the limits of language. How could I convey the profundity of a silence so alive, so full, that it encompassed all things? How could I describe the moment when all distinctions dissolve and only unity remains? The words I spoke felt inadequate, like trying to hold water in a cup. Instead, I invited those who sought truth to sit with me in quiet, to experience the silence themselves. Some resisted, uneasy with the absence of speech, the unfamiliar stillness. Others, more open, closed their eyes and listened with their hearts, and in that shared silence, a subtle awakening took root. Silence became my teacher and sanctuary. It strips away the masks we wear, the pretenses, the illusions, the defenses, and reveals our true selves. In silence, we encounter not only God but our own souls, laid bare in vulnerability and longing. This is why so many flee from silence. It confronts us with the deepest truths, the wounds we hide, the fears we deny. But for the seeker, silence is a gateway to healing, transformation, and ultimate union. In my own journey, this paradox has been both challenge and blessing. My desire to teach, to inspire, to guide is strong, but I have learned to temper it with humility, to listen more than I speak, to honor the pauses where silence dwells. This practice has deepened my connection not only to the divine but also to the people around me. In silence, a profound presence can be shared, beyond words, beyond thought, beyond time. I have also witnessed how silence nourishes love in its purest form. True love needs no explanation. It lives in the quiet gaze, the unspoken touch, the breath held together in stillness. When two souls meet in silence, without the clutter of words, there is a sacred communion that transcends the limits of language. This love is the heartbeat of the cosmos, the sacred pulse that connects all beings. Reflecting on all these truths, I see that silence is not merely an absence, but the very fabric of existence, woven by the divine hand. Every sound, every word, every expression arises from this silence and returns to it. To live in harmony with silence is to live in grace, to walk the path of love and truth with an open heart. And so, I continue on this path, carrying silence as my closest companion, inviting all who seek to listen deeply to hear the sacred language beyond speech, the eternal silence of God that speaks directly to the soul. There was a time in my life when I believed that mastery over words was the key to unlocking the mysteries of the divine. I spent countless hours immersed in scripture, philosophy, and poetry, honing my ability to articulate the inexpressible, to capture the beauty of God's creation through the rhythm and melody of language. My verses flowed like rivers, my sermons stirred the hearts of many, and I took pride in the power of my speech to move souls toward love and understanding. Yet, beneath this outward confidence, a subtle unrest stirred within me, a whisper that told me words, no matter how eloquent, were but fragile vessels, incapable of holding the vast ocean of divine truth. This realization did not dawn suddenly. It was a slow, often painful unfolding, like the breaking of dawn through layers of night. I recall many nights spent alone in my chamber, candlelight flickering against the walls, shadows dancing like restless spirits. My mind, usually so quick to shape thoughts into poetry or teaching, would sometimes still itself, caught in a tension between knowing and not knowing. In these moments, the silence around me was thick, almost tangible, pressing gently against my soul. I used to resist it, filling the space with prayer or verse, afraid that silence was emptiness, a void to be feared. But slowly, with patient surrender, I came to recognize that this silence was not a mere absence of sound. It was a presence so profound that it transcended all speech and thought. Within this sacred silence, I encountered a language unlike any I had known before, a language without words, yet speaking directly to the heart. It was as if the divine had set aside the clamor of human tongues to whisper softly in the spaces between, in the pauses that give breath to life. This silence was alive, vibrating with the eternal truth that no mortal phrase could capture. It was the primordial language of God, the very essence from which all words arise and to which they inevitably return. Reflecting on this, I understood how all my previous attempts to describe God, to teach the nature of love and union, were but imperfect translations. Like a traveler who tries to carry the scent of a rose in a jar, my words could capture only a faint hint of the fragrance, never its full essence. The poets and sages before me had all wrestled with this truth, each seeking to illuminate the path with language, yet always falling short of the source itself. Words are like shadows cast by the light of silence. They reveal form but not the fullness behind it. This insight transformed my relationship with language and silence. I came to see that words are sacred tools, but they must be wielded with humility and awareness of their limits. They serve to guide seekers toward the silence, to point beyond themselves rather than to become an end in themselves. The true meeting with God happens not in speech, but in the quiet chambers of the soul where silence reigns. In daily life, I began to practice this awareness, learning to pause before speaking, to listen deeply not only to others but also to the silence that underlies all communication. I discovered that profound connection often arises not from the exchange of words, but from shared presence in silence. When two hearts meet in quiet companionship, a conversation unfolds that surpasses language, reaching into the depths where only love dwells. Silence also revealed itself as a healer. Our incessant chatter, the endless noise of thought and speech, often drowns out the subtle voice of the soul, the voice of intuition, compassion, and wisdom. By embracing silence, we create space for that inner voice to emerge, for wounds to mend, for the spirit to find rest. Silence teaches us patience and surrender. It invites us to trust the unseen rhythms of life and the unfolding of divine will. I saw too how fear often drives people away from silence. To be silent is to confront ourselves without distraction, to face the hidden fears, desires, and vulnerabilities that words sometimes mask. But it is precisely in this courageous embrace of silence that transformation occurs. The soul is purified, the heart softened, and the path toward union illuminated. In my poetry, I strive to honor the sacredness of silence. I do not seek to fill every space with words, but rather to let the unspoken breathe alongside the spoken, to create a dance between presence and absence, sound and stillness. The spaces between verses, the pauses that linger after a line is read, hold a sacred power. They invite the reader into silence, to listen with the heart, and to encounter the divine beyond the veil of language. When I teach, I encourage my students not only to pursue knowledge but to cultivate the capacity for stillness. I urge them to seek the silent sanctuary within themselves where the divine dwells unseen. This is no easy task, for the mind craves certainty, the ego demands control. But those who dare to sit in silence find a wellspring of wisdom that surpasses all learning. Ultimately, I have come to accept that all human expression, our prayers, songs, teachings, and stories, are but echoes of the sacred silence. They are beautiful and necessary, yet incomplete. The full truth is found only in silence, in the wordless communion where the soul meets God face to face. This is the language that transcends all others, not spoken, written, or sung, but lived in the quiet presence of love itself. So I continue to walk this path, carrying silence as my closest companion and deepest teacher. I listen for the unspoken voice, the sacred language beyond words, the eternal silence of God that speaks directly to the heart. And with every breath, I surrender to that silent song, knowing that in silence alone lies the fullness of truth, the infinite embrace of the beloved, and the home of the soul. There is a delicate power in silence that I have come to cherish more deeply with each passing day, a power not to be underestimated or mistaken for weakness. In silence, I have found a space vast and boundless, a sanctuary where the soul can rest and reveal its true nature without fear or disguise. The lessons of silence are many, and some of the most profound have come through moments when words failed, when speech seemed inadequate or even misleading. I have learned that in silence, the truth speaks more clearly than any eloquent discourse, and love flows more freely than in the most passionate declarations. I remember times when I was surrounded by crowds, friends, disciples, seekers, all eager to hear my words, to grasp the wisdom I tried to impart. Yet in those moments, I often felt the limitations of language keenly. The words I spoke were but rough sketches of the infinite, shadows of the divine's radiant reality. No matter how carefully I chose my expressions, how beautifully I crafted my verses, there remained an unbridgeable gap between what could be said and what needed to be felt. I realized that my true role was not merely to teach with words, but to guide others toward the silence where understanding blooms naturally, without the constraints of intellect. There was a particular evening I recall vividly, when this truth unveiled itself with striking clarity. I sat in a circle with my closest companions, the flickering light of oil lamps casting dancing patterns on their faces. The conversation had grown heated, words rushing forth in an attempt to explain and to convince. But I saw the agitation in their eyes, the exhaustion in their spirits, the futility in the endless exchange. At that moment, I chose to fall silent. Not out of resignation or avoidance, but as an offering, an invitation to rest from the noise and to enter the quiet depths together. The silence was at first uncomfortable. Some shifted uneasily, searching for the next phrase to break the stillness. Others simply closed their eyes and breathed deeply, surrendering to the moment. And then, as if a veil had been lifted, the atmosphere changed. A gentle peace settled among us, a sacred presence that needed no words to be known. In that silence, hearts spoke to hearts, souls connected without the need for explanation. The unspoken understanding was more profound than any argument could have been. This experience taught me that silence is not absence, but presence. It is the space where the divine dwells most fully, where truth reveals itself without distortion or distraction. It is a language without vocabulary, a dialogue beyond sound. To embrace silence is to step into the eternal now, where all judgments fall away, and only pure being remains. In the solitude of my own heart, I have often turned to silence as a refuge and a guide. When sorrow presses heavy upon me, when doubts cloud the mind, or when joy swells too great for words, I seek the quiet sanctuary within. There, in the stillness, I am reminded that all emotions are like waves on the ocean's surface, temporary and passing. The ocean itself remains calm and vast beneath. Silence is that ocean, the eternal ground beneath the shifting tides of life. Through silence, I have also come to know the depth of love in its purest form. Love need not be shouted from rooftops or declared in grand gestures. True love is often the gentle presence beside another, the quiet support without conditions, the silent sharing of a glance that speaks volumes. In moments of deepest love, words become unnecessary, the soul recognizes itself in another's gaze, and a sacred unity blossoms without sound. I have witnessed how silence can dissolve conflicts and heal wounds that words only deepen. When we rush to speak, to defend, to persuade, we often build walls around our hearts. But silence softens these walls, melts away pride, and opens a space where compassion can enter. It invites patience, understanding, and forgiveness. In silence, the heart can listen, not only to others but to itself, and find the courage to transform. I have come to accept that living fully in silence is a continual practice, a discipline that requires humility and courage. The world often demands noise, busyness, and constant expression. Yet, I have learned that to truly know the divine and to love deeply, one must cultivate the ability to be still, to listen deeply, and to rest in the sacred quiet. Silence is the teacher who never tires, the companion who never abandons, the doorway through which we enter the mystery. In my poetry and teachings, I endeavor to honor this sacred silence by creating spaces where it can breathe. I leave pauses, gaps between verses, and moments of quiet reflection so that the reader or listener might encounter the divine beyond the words. For it is in those spaces, the silences between speech, that the soul meets God most directly. As I continue on this path, I hold silence as my closest friend and most faithful guide. It is the language in which the beloved whispers, the canvas upon which all creation is painted, the breath that animates life itself. And I walk with gratitude, knowing that in silence lies the deepest truth, the purest love, and the eternal embrace of the divine presence that dwells within us all. But there is more to silence than rest and peace. It is also the forge of transformation. In silence, the soul confronts its own shadows, the fears, the doubts, the attachments that bind and blind. The absence of distraction lays bare the inner landscape, revealing the fractures and wounds we often hide behind words and actions. This revelation is not easy, for silence is an uncompromising mirror that shows us exactly what we are. Yet, it is precisely this honest encounter that allows the soul to heal, to grow, and to awaken. Through silence, the heart learns to surrender its old burdens, releasing them into the vastness where they dissolve and lose their power. I have walked this path, sometimes hesitantly, sometimes with fierce determination. There have been moments when silence felt like a wilderness, lonely and harsh, testing every fiber of my being. Yet, even in those dark nights, silence offered a subtle promise that beyond the struggle lies the light of transformation, the dawn of a new understanding. To embrace silence fully is to embrace the entire human experience, joy and sorrow, light and shadow, birth and death, and to find in this embrace the unity that transcends all duality. The sacred silence is also a language of compassion. When I witness another's suffering, my first response is often silence, an open heart that listens without interruption or judgment. In that silent presence, a space is created where pain can be held tenderly, where healing begins not through words, but through shared being. I have seen how silence can convey empathy more profoundly than any spoken consolation. It is in this quiet communion that souls find refuge and strength to carry on. Moreover, silence is the birthplace of creativity. The poet's mind is nourished by the fertile void between words, the painter's vision shaped in the stillness before the brush moves. In silence, inspiration flows freely, unbound by the constraints of logic or convention. It is a sacred wellspring from which all beauty arises. I have come to trust silence as my most faithful muse, guiding my pen and my voice to express not merely ideas, but the living spirit that animates them. As I contemplate the role of silence in my life and teachings, I recognize that it is both the beginning and the end, the alpha and omega of spiritual journey. It is where the soul begins its quest and where it finally rests in union with the beloved. Every word spoken, every prayer uttered, every song sung is but a temporary bridge to the eternal silence that enfolds all existence. Therefore, I invite all seekers to embrace silence, not as emptiness or absence, but as the fullness of divine presence. To sit in silence is to open the door to the sacred, to listen with the heart's ear to the whispers of eternity. It is a practice of love, patience, and surrender, a path that leads beyond the confines of the mind into the boundless realm of spirit. In this way, silence becomes not merely the language of God, but the very breath of life itself, the quiet pulse that sustains the cosmos, the gentle touch that awakens the soul, and the eternal song that sings us home. In the long journey of my soul, I have come to understand that silence is not simply a momentary stillness or a pause between words. It is the very essence of existence, the language through which the divine reveals itself most purely and intimately. To speak of God is to attempt to describe a light so brilliant that it blinds the eyes. To use words to contain the infinite is to catch the wind in one's hands. Yet silence, in its profound depth, embraces the boundless without effort or limitation. It is the language in which God communes with creation, the eternal speech that neither begins nor ends, and in which all opposites, joy and sorrow, presence and absence, life and death, are held in perfect harmony. I recall sitting alone beneath the vast sky, the stars spreading like jewels across the midnight canvas, when this truth settled upon me with the weight of 1,000 revelations. The universe spoke not in words but in silence, the silence between the stars, the silence of the dark spaces where light was yet to be born, the silence that held all things in being. In that cosmic stillness, I felt myself dissolve into the infinite expanse, my individual self melting away until only the pure presence remained. It was a moment of such clarity and surrender that the boundaries between myself and the divine vanished. There was no longer a me listening or a God speaking. There was only the one, eternal silence in which all is contained and none is separate. This silence is not cold or empty but alive with love and wisdom beyond all comprehension. It is the sacred ground beneath the shifting sands of life, the wellspring from which all creation flows and to which it ultimately returns. In this silence, time ceases to exist, and the eternal now unfolds in infinite grace. It is a presence that transcends thought and feeling, a language beyond language, where understanding is immediate and whole. Throughout my life, I have sought to guide others toward this silent place, not by filling their minds with words, but by inviting them to listen beyond words. To encounter silence fully is to meet the divine face to face, to touch the heart of reality itself. It is a journey that requires courage, for silence reveals all things as they are, our fears, our illusions, our deepest desires, and yet, it also reveals the love that underlies all existence, the unchanging light that shines through every shadow. I have learned that silence is the ultimate teacher. It does not offer answers in the way that words do, but it opens the soul to the truth that lies beyond all answers. In silence, the soul learns to trust, to surrender, and to be present. It is a language that speaks directly to the heart, bypassing the filters of the mind and the barriers of the ego. This is why so many of the greatest mysteries and truths have been preserved not in books, but in moments of stillness, in the quiet spaces where seekers have dwelled in the presence of the beloved. Silence is also a balm for the restless heart. When the mind is overwhelmed by confusion, doubt, or sorrow, silence offers refuge, a safe harbor where the spirit can find peace. In silence, the soul is gently cradled, healed, and restored. It is a space where the broken pieces can be gathered and mended, where the weight of suffering is lifted by the light of divine presence. This healing power of silence is perhaps one of its greatest gifts to humanity. In my poetry and teachings, I strive to honor this sacred silence by creating moments of stillness within the flow of words. I recognize that no matter how beautifully crafted, words can only point toward the truth, they cannot contain it. Therefore, I leave space between verses, pauses between thoughts, so that the reader or listener may step into the silence and encounter the divine directly. These moments of quiet are invitations to rest in the eternal language of God, to feel the sacred presence that permeates all things. As I reflect on my own path, I see that silence has been the constant thread weaving through every experience, every joy and sorrow, every question and answer. It is the home to which I return again and again, the still center around which my life revolves. Even in the midst of teaching, writing, and speaking, I carry silence within me as a sacred companion, reminding me of the limits of language and the vastness of what lies beyond. To live in awareness of this silence is to live in grace. It is to recognize that all things, light and shadow, sound and silence, life and death, are expressions of the same eternal truth. It is to embrace the mystery of existence without needing to grasp or control it. And in this embrace, the soul finds freedom, joy, and peace beyond all understanding. So I continue on this journey, ever listening for the silent song that underlies all speech, ever seeking the sacred stillness that is the true language of God. I invite all who walk this path to join me in the quiet, to surrender the need for words and explanations, and to open themselves to the boundless silence where love, wisdom, and truth reside. For in that silence, we find not emptiness, but fullness, not absence, but presence, not separation, but unity with the divine and with all creation. This is the language of God, silent, infinite, eternal, and all else is but poor translation. And yet, I must confess, this journey into silence is not an easy path. It is fraught with challenges, for the mind resists the stillness, clings to noise, to distractions, to the illusion of control that speech affords. There are moments when the silence feels like a void, vast and daunting, threatening to swallow the self whole. It is here, in these deep wells of solitude, that the soul must find courage to remain steadfast, to trust that the silence is not emptiness but the fertile ground of transformation. I have known loneliness in silence, the ache of absence, the yearning for something tangible to hold on to. Yet, I have learned that this very longing is itself a doorway, a call to dive deeper, to surrender more fully, and to be reborn into the vast embrace of the divine. In the silence, I have discovered a sacred alchemy at work. The boundaries that separate self from other, life from death, and the finite from the infinite begin to dissolve. In that dissolution, a profound unity emerges, a recognition that all is one, and one is all. This is the truth that silence reveals, the interconnectedness of all beings, the oneness of existence, and the presence of God in every breath and every moment. It is a truth that words can hint at but never fully capture. I have also come to see that silence is not merely an individual experience but a communal gift. When people come together in shared silence, whether in prayer, meditation, or simply sitting quietly in each other's presence, a sacred space is created. In this space, the walls of misunderstanding, judgment, and fear fall away, and the heart opens to compassion, empathy, and love. This is the power of silence to heal relationships, to build bridges where words have failed, and to awaken the collective spirit. Moreover, silence is a source of creativity and inspiration. Before a poet's pen touches the paper, before a melody arises from the lips, there is a moment of silent receptivity, a pause where the soul listens and receives. It is in this sacred stillness that the divine breath stirs the imagination, whispering the seeds of new creation. I have come to honor these moments, guarding them carefully, knowing that they are precious gifts from the beloved. In the final measure, to live with silence as one's language is to live in a state of continual openness and surrender. It is to accept that the mysteries of life and God are not puzzles to be solved but mysteries to be lived. It is to rest in the paradoxes, the uncertainties, and the ineffable beauty of existence without the need for certainty or explanation. This is the deepest freedom, the freedom that silence offers to the soul willing to listen. Thus, I walk onward, a humble seeker in the vast temple of silence. I cherish the moments when the world falls away, when the noise ceases, and the sacred stillness speaks. In that language without words, I find my true home, the eternal conversation between the soul and the divine, carried not on the wings of speech, but on the breath of silence itself. Here, in this silent embrace, I know that I am truly alive, truly loved, and eternally one with all that is.